EnCrypted Classic Horror with Jasper L'Estrange. Tales of horror, mystery, and suspense. Godfrey Lear was unaccustomed to visitors. For the last 2 years, he had lived in a tumble-down cottage at the very end of a rambling dirt track through a glum wood, on the outskirts of a remote village in a part of Norfolk to which no one ever went. The village was unprepossessing. The dirt track was grimly forbidding. There was no earthly reason for a living soul to trudge the dismal half-mile to his door, and consequently very few ever did. And that was just the way he hoped to keep it. So when he heard the sharp knock on his door that October evening, he was startled. He actually jumped from his seat. He felt suddenly anxious, undeservedly so, he was sure, since whoever had knocked was unlikely to have any sinister purpose. It was too late for the postman, of course, but it could be someone from the village collecting for a charity, or a lost traveller, perhaps with a broken-down motor car and the need of a telephone. Both had happened before, and while the charity collector no doubt regretted her fruitless trek, Lear had kindly sent the stranded motorist back up the path with directions to the village telephone box. After all, he reflected later, he was a misanthrope, but not a monster. In the event, however, he decided against answering the door and picked up the book he had been reading. But there came another knock, more insistent now, and since his visitor seemed intent on giving him no peace until his knock was answered, Lear rose, grumbling from the armchair, and moved down the hall. The bolts were drawn back, the chain undone, the key turned, and the door opened an inch, just enough for Lear to peer out into the foggy darkness. Out, and then down. He immediately smiled and relaxed, remembering the date. His visitors, there were 2, not 1, were clearly children. Clearly because of their height and their voices when they spoke. Not from their faces, which were hidden, of course, behind masks. It was October the 31st. Halloween.
Trick or treat,
said the children. They were girls, evidently. Lear regarded them. They stood in his porch with their little baskets, ever so still, looking up at him, although their eyes were no more than twinkling lights in the black recesses behind the holes in their masks. They must be cold, he thought. It was a chilly evening, and they had on what to him looked more like summer dresses, and no coats. He looked past them into the fog, expecting to see a watchful parent a short distance back. If there was, they were not instantly visible. "You're a long way from home," he said. "Are you on your own?"
it's Halloween,
said one child, the taller of the 2.
Have you any sweets?
said the other. Lear hesitated then, unsure of the proper action to take. It was rash, perhaps, to invite the children inside, but it seemed cruel to send them away unrewarded when they had traversed the length of that gloomy dirt track, especially on such a beastly night as this. "Sweets, no," he said, "but I may have some drinking chocolate. I could make you a cup each. You look as if you need warming up," he added. The children looked at each other, then back at Lear. Then they surprised him by walking past him under his arm that held the door open. He watched them move silently along the hall and turn into his kitchen, his mouth agape. He pushed the door shut, and as an afterthought, locked and bolted it too. When he joined them in the kitchen, he started again, for it was as though, in the harsh electric light of that room, he was seeing them for the first time as they stood, statue still, by the Welsh dresser. He had only dimly perceived their childish forms in the fog-bound darkness. Now he saw that their summer dresses were in fact faded, begrimed, ragged, which even Lear curmudgeon that he was, recognised was part of the Halloween aesthetic. They were evidently in costume, as, some Victorian schoolchildren returned from the grave, no doubt, even if their dresses were not remotely Victorian. He knew children well enough to know that one must sometimes use one's imagination to see the world through the child's eyes. But the masks they wore struck him as being very odd. They were not the kind of thing you would find at a store. The usual facile representation of some mythic creature or ghoul, the green-hued witch with the pointed nose, or the white-faced, white-fanged vampire with the blood-red lips. No, they were simple oval masks with holes cut out imperfectly for the eyes and mouth, and fashioned out of, he struggled to recall the correct term from his own childhood, papier-mâché. That was it. He quite wanted to applaud the two children for their industry. The masks, though primitive, really were uncanny to look at, far more so than anything you could buy in a store. Instead, he said, "Hot chocolate. Just the ticket for a night like this. Let me make it." After some ferreting, he found an old tin of instant hot chocolate powder and busied himself with cups and putting a kettle of water on the stove to boil. "There," he said. "It shan't take long. Take a seat at the table, won't you?" The children sat, obediently. In the sudden silence that now fell, Lear became absurdly aware of the kitchen clock's loud ticking, and how the quiet children seemed to be watching him, inscrutably, through the narrow eyelets in their masks. "You live in the village, then?" he asked. It seemed obvious they must, but he said it for want of something to say.
We are not from around here,
the older child said.
We have come here for Halloween,
said the other.
Our favourite time.
Right, I see, said Lear.
Tell us a scary story,
said the older child.
Scare us,
said the other.
We like to be scared,
they said together. Lear felt at once flummoxed and unnerved by the request, harmless though it undoubtedly was. Unprepared was perhaps the more appropriate word. Living alone in his remote location, he was unused to speaking to another, let alone telling a story. But, he reasoned, these were children, and it was Halloween. As it happened, the book he was presently reading contained a few stories that had the requisite touch of horror, and would do the job as well as anything he himself could invent at short notice. He glanced at the kettle that stood on the hob of the gas stove, the water already beginning to seethe inside. "Okay," he said, sitting down with them at the table. "Let me tell you this one. I often admired the great carved coral ring that Jim Mason used to wear on the second finger of his right hand. It wasn't exactly beautiful, but it was fascinating. At a first glance, it appeared to be just a flat piece of coral, set in old gold and projecting in a rather curious way from the shank. I never mentioned it to him, for he was a queer chap and usually resented any personal remark, but one night he must have seen me looking at it, for he held it out for my inspection. It was then I noticed, for the first time, a tiny head carved in the centre of the coral. "Have a good look at it," Mason said. "One really needs a magnifying glass to see it properly, but your eyes are good and you should be able to make it out." I examined it carefully. The head was that of a man wearing earrings and a sort of scarf swathed round his brows. "Is it a gypsy?" I asked. "So they say," Mason replied. "The ring is about 300 years old, at least, and there's rather an interesting tale about it if you care to hear the yarn." Naturally, I jumped at the offer, for, as I have intimated, Jim wasn't exactly a sociable kind of chap usually. He plunged into his story at once. "We call it the death ring, or the gypsy ring, and it has been in my family for over 250 years. First of all, I ought to tell you that we are of gypsy descent. One of my ancestors is said to have been the ruler of a tribe of Spanish gypsies. I suppose that is why we are all so dark-featured. Sometime towards the end of the 17th century, when gypsies were mixed up with state and political affairs in Spain, this ancestor of mine was called in to advise a prince of the royal blood how to rid himself of a deadly rival. The gypsy had only one suggestion to offer, and that was death. He became friendly with his victim, wormed himself into his confidence, and made out that he was his staunch ally. One night he suggested that he could provide the young man with a very beautiful girl. Nothing doubting, the youth arranged that the lady should be secretly admitted to his presence at a late hour. Her pass should be this very ring which my ancestor always wore on his finger. The girl was the gypsy's daughter, and she came to the rendezvous armed with a poisoned dagger. The ring admitted her to the young man's presence, and without hesitation, she plunged the dagger into his heart. As the boy was dying, he cursed the gypsy who had betrayed his trust. "See," he cried, pointing to the ring. "Already it is blood-stained. Blood-stained it shall always be. Once in every 20 years it shall cause the death of the person who wears it." Even as he spoke, the girl looked down at the ring and to her horror perceived that the coral was flecked with blood. The stain is still there. He held out the ring again, and on looking at it closely I saw little dark flecks in the bright red of the coral. "I can't tell you what happened after the murder," Mason went on. "All I do know is that the curse seems to have worked. My great-grandfather was showing a gun to a friend when the ring caught in the trigger and the weapon went off and blew his brains out. My own father tried to get rid of the gem. In fact, he gave it away 3 times, but in each case it was returned to him. And now I am its fortunate possessor. And I sometimes wonder what my end will be." He laughed as he finished the tale, swallowed his drink, and with a hurried good night, left. It sounds a rather weak story, and I should never have thought of telling it, but for a paragraph in this morning's paper, "Death of well-known traveller," it is headed, and continues thus. "The Battersea coroner yesterday held an inquest on the body of Mr. James Mason, the well-known traveller and explorer. As already reported in our columns, Mr. Mason's body was found in a gas-filled room in his Battersea flat on Thursday morning. The deceased was in the habit of wearing a curiously large ring set with a coral cameo, and it is thought that after turning off the gas before retiring, he may have caught the ring on the stop tap and thus inadvertently turned it on again. A verdict of death by misadventure was returned." As he concluded, the kettle was just beginning to sing. He stood up and attended to it. The children had been almost preternaturally silent throughout the duration of his story, and only now, with his back turned to them as he mixed the freshly boiled water with the cocoa powder. Did they speak?
"That's not a true story,"
said the older child.
"That didn't happen."
"Could have happened," said Lear, feeling slightly injured. "People do gas themselves to death, you know, by accident or otherwise."
We only like true horror stories,
said the younger one.
"There aren't any such things as magic rings."
"Children these days," thought Lear wearily, wise beyond their years.
"Tell us a proper scary story,"
the little child continued.
"A true one that really happened,"
the other said.
"Scare us,"
they said together. He returned to the table with the steaming hot cups of drinking chocolate and set them down in front of his young guests. "Be careful," he warned. "They're very hot. Why don't I tell you about something that happened to my friend Raymond?" The children leaned in, and he began. Raymond Shaw told me this story himself, and as it happened to him, he should know more about it than anyone. Before he married, he was a great walker, and most of his holidays were spent wandering just as his fancy dictated. He knew all those pleasant byways between Dartford and Canterbury. He had visited every abbey in Yorkshire, and climbed most of the Welsh mountains. One year, it must have been soon after the end of the war, he decided to take a late autumn vacation in Derbyshire. It was a county he had never explored, but he knew that it was the walker's paradise. Derbyshire did not disappoint him. The weather was glorious, and he lingered in Dovedale, camped in Millersdale, tramped through the Manifold Valley, and explored the great caves near Castleton. One evening he found himself down in the pine woods on the banks of the River Goyt, and as there was a hint of rain in the air, he decided to push on to Buxton. According to the map, there was a choice of 3 ways: over the Goyt Bridge and up the bridle path to the main Manchester to Buxton road, up to the Cat and Fiddle and down from there, or a shortcut, over the moors. He was debating which way to choose when a couple of workmen came along. Raymond accosted them and asked if the moorland path was easy to find. "Aye," answered one of the men. "It's easy enough, but it's getting dark, and I should leave the moors alone. Stick to one of the main roads." "But I have an electric torch," said Raymond, "and if the path is a good one, it should save me a few miles." "Keep away from the moors, lad," chimed in the other man. "There's things up there after nightfall." "What sort of things?" asked Raymond, whose besetting sin was always curiosity. The men shrugged their shoulders and looked rather sheepish. Obviously they wanted to warn him against something, but could not bring themselves to be more explicit. "The moors are always queer after dark," volunteered the first speaker, "and it's best to take the high road." "I don't agree," laughed Raymond. "I like quiet places at night. Thanks for your advice." He jumped a fence and crossed the river by the stepping stones. The men watched him in silence as he climbed through the heather and bracken. Then one shouted something after him, but he failed to catch the words. Within a few minutes he struck the track and was soon high above the valley. It was a lonely, deserted spot. In places the bracken grew waist-high by the side of the path, and huge boulders dotted the landscape. Here and there was the crumbling shaft of some long-deserted mine, and the only sound was the plaintive call of the curlews. Raymond can never say when the other man joined him or where he came from, but suddenly there he was walking at his side, quite a pleasant-looking chap dressed in rough corduroys. "Good evening," said Raymond. "I think it's blowing up for some rain." "Aye," was the answer. "There'll be plenty of it before the moon is up." Raymond was glad of company, but he found his companion disinclined to talk. They covered a mile or so in silence, and then a ruin of some kind loomed up through the dusk. "What is that?" Raymond exclaimed.
"Death House,"
was the reply.
"That's what it's called hereabouts."
It's a gloomy name. Why do they call it that?"
"Would you really like to know?"
"I should," replied Raymond, curious as ever.
"Then let us sit down here for a few minutes,"
said the man, indicating a large stone. The two seated themselves side by side, and the stranger began his tale.
"It was in 1882 when Job McNelson, who owned a bit of moor about half a mile away from here, discovered a vein of gold ore in a pit he was working on his property. Job went mad, and having a bit of money saved up, decided to go in for gold mining on a grand scale. But he didn't want government inspectors butting in, so he had to move warily. He needed a strong, trustworthy man to assist him, and it was then he remembered Harry Green, who had been his pal at school. Well, Harry was soon discovered in London, and he was out of a job. Being something of an adventurer, Job's scheme appealed to him, and he threw in his lot with his old friend. The two journeyed back to Derbyshire together, and it was arranged that Harry should live with Job at his house. That's it behind us, but it was called Moorland View in those days, and was as pretty a home as you could find in this part of the country. But it was terribly lonely, and the loneliness had already got on Mary McNelson's nerves. She was Job's wife, a dainty wisp of a girl he had married in Manchester. She hated the moors, and was glad of a visitor to cheer her up a little. To cut a long story short, the mine proved to be a failure. A tiny vein of ore does not make a gold mine, and that's all there was in Job McNelson's pit. But Job was firmly convinced that a large vein would eventually be discovered, and went on blasting and digging long after Harry had abandoned hope. He was down in the earth at all hours of the day and night, and the girl from Manchester and the man from London were thrown more and more together. Of course, they fell in love with each other, and she forgot that she was Job's wife, whilst Harry forgot that he was Job's friend. That's the way things happen. I can't say when Job discovered how things were between his wife and Harry, but he kept very quiet about it, and planned a terrible revenge in secret. One day he came in and declared that he had discovered a rich lode, and invited Harry to go down the pit and see for himself. The Londoner needed no second bidding. He descended the shaft and made his way to the spot Job had indicated. There was no gold there, but there was a charge of explosive fitted with a time fuse. It went off whilst Harry was probing around, and in a matter of seconds he was dead under a load of rock and earth, with half his face blown to pieces. In Moorland View, the man and the woman heard the explosion, and after he had finished laughing, Job told his wife what had happened. He was quite demented, and made such a poor job of killing her with a carving knife that she was able to get away from him, with her throat half cut through. He caught her by this very stone, and completed the job. Then he went back to his home and hanged himself behind the door. And that's why they call the place Death House.
What a ghastly story, said Raymond. One blown to pieces, the other hacked to death, and the third hanged.
Oh, Harry wasn't exactly blown to pieces, replied the man, slowly. Only one side of his face was blown off. Like this.
He turned the other side of his face to where the light of the rising moon fell upon it.
Like this.
A workman crossing the moors about 7 o'clock in the morning found Raymond lying on the path about a mile away from Death House. He must have fainted when he saw what the moonlight revealed, and afterwards, in a semi-conscious state, have crawled away from the haunted spot. Pretty terrifying stuff, eh? Said Leah, and a cautionary, true tale about what horrors can befall those who go pottering about in desolate, dark places late at night. Which reminds me, won't your parents be getting anxious about you by now? It's getting rather late.
We don't have any parents, mister,
said the older child.
We're orphans,
said the younger.
She means orphans.
The other corrected. Oh, I'm sorry, said Leah. But you must have someone.
Tell us another story,
said the older child.
A real one this time, something that happened to you,
said the other.
Scare us, mister. We like being scared. It makes us feel alive. Scare us,
they said together. Lear was beginning to feel absurdly like a middle-aged male Scheherazade, spinning fictions to postpone some dreadful fate. But of course, these two young children were not going to behead him in the morning. And at any rate, they had far more to fear from him than he had from them, if they only knew. There was, however, something unsettling about these children. It irritated him that they persisted in wearing their masks. He was not by nature easily spooked, but he was unnerved by those expressionless faces and the strange glint from the dark hollows. "Your chocolate should be cool enough to drink now," he said. "Why don't you take off those masks and have some?" Obediently, the children removed their masks and placed them on the table in front of them. Lear now saw two girls' faces looking back at him, pale, freckled, innocent, expectant. "Very well," said Lear. "One last story. Now drink your chocolate. This is something that happened to me some years ago. Why, in the month of October, as it happens. It was really rather foolish of me to decide to take a tramping holiday in Cornwall during the month of October. But beggars can't be choosers, and I had been engaged on a new book all through the summer, and had to see it through the press before I could think of a holiday. I passed the final proofs on October the 1st, and there and then made up my mind to pack a few things in a rucksack and go down to Bude. From there I planned to walk around the coast to Penzance. Cornwall is an ideal country in the summertime when the moors are green with bracken. The sea is quiet and friendly, the rugged cliffs gleam in the sunshine, and the fairies dance round the holy wells. With the coming of autumn, it seems that the good fairies abandon Cornwall to unfriendly spirits. The moorlands become treacherous black bogs. White mists swirl up from the sea, and the cliffs are like giants ready to devour whatever comes their way. I tramped from Bude to Boscastle and on to Wadebridge, and each hour I regretted my foolhardiness more and more. I spent a couple of days at Newquay, and then, determined in a pig-headed fashion to stick to my plans, I set off for St. Ives. The interesting church and holy well at Cubit claimed my attention, and I lingered there longer than I should have done. By the time I got to St. Agnes, it was already afternoon, and I still had another 16 miles or so to journey before I reached my destination. The map showed that the cliff road would knock off at least 4 miles, but there was always a chance that by keeping to the main highway I might be able to get a bus. On inquiring at St. Agnes, this proved to be a forlorn hope. After the summer season, the bus service had been considerably curtailed, and only one bus a day passed through the village. That had left at 2 o'clock, so without asking advice on the matter, I decided to follow the cliff road. For the first few miles, it certainly was a road, and then without any warning it became little better than a grass track. The going was very hard, and the silence began to get on my nerves. Here and there, the abandoned shaft of some old mine raised its jagged point to the sky, and an occasional stunted tree looked like a hideous witch, brooding over the sea. Birds screeched mournfully, and the lapping waves made a music far from pleasant. I cursed myself for a fool, but it was too late for regrets, and I trudged on. It was getting dusk when the accident happened. I was walking at a good pace when I stepped into a crevice and twisted my ankle. I went blind with pain for a moment and, half fainting, dragged myself to a mound at the side of the path. The ankle swelled at an alarming rate, and a bandage, hastily improvised from a couple of handkerchiefs, was worse than useless. There was I, out on the cliffs between St. Agnes and St. Ives, faced with the prospect of spending the night in that bleak spot with not even a bush to serve as a shelter. I tried to hobble on, but progress was impossible. I made myself as comfortable as I could, but the pain was agonizing. The sea was at least 200 feet below, and there was not a drop of water handy to give my ankle relief. I lay there, almost numb with cold, praying for some good Samaritan to come my way. I must have fallen to sleep, for when I next looked at the luminous dial of my wristwatch, it was 11:15, and far away out at sea, a red light was winking on some buoy. It was then I heard the chug-chug of a motor. It never occurred to me to wonder how a car could be travelling along the cliff road. Nearer and nearer came the sound, and 2 yellow lights gleamed through the darkness. With a great effort, I struggled to my feet and stood in the path of the oncoming vehicle, shouting and waving my arms. It pulled up with a grinding of brakes, and I was able to make out that it was an old-fashioned motor coach, evidently taking a party of roisterers home. It was full of people, and they were all singing a most dismal song. "Can you give me a lift to St. Ives?" I shouted. The driver, who seemed to be muffled up to his eyes in a great cloak, leaned from his seat and in a queer, high-pitched voice answered, "Room for one." I pulled myself up the steps of the coach, and the passengers stopped their singing and turned their heads to watch me, but not one of them offered to give me a hand. The vacant seat was in front, and I fell into it just as the coach, with an awful rattle, started off again. I turned to my neighbour with a word of apology for my clumsiness, but he, like the driver, seemed to be muffled in a scarf or cloak, and all I could see of him were 2 eyes that glowed in a strangely phosphorescent manner. It was then that I became aware of the smell. At first I thought it was bad fish, but although I caught traces of the dank odour of seaweed, the stench was worse than the most rotten fish could ever emit. Something cold and slimy touched my neck. I put up my hand and removed it. It was a tiny crab. Then something else touched me. It was the hand of my neighbour on the seat, and it was even colder than the crab had been. With claw-like fingers, I felt him push back my coat sleeve and pinch the flesh of my arm. Another cold and bony hand came from behind and felt my neck, and all the time the rotten odour of corruption was getting stronger. Either the interior of the coach suddenly became lighter, or my eyes became accustomed to the gloom, for at that moment I found myself able to see something of the features of my travelling companions. Merciful God grant that I never gaze upon such a sight again. I was in the company of the dead. What I had taken to be scarves about their necks were hundreds of mussels and barnacles clinging in ghastly collars. The faces of these men were eaten away. The flesh hung in mouldering shreds, and crabs wriggled in the hollows where eyes should have been. With a shriek, I tried to rise from my seat, but those fleshless hands held me down. I kicked and struggled. I felt their fingers snap like rotten wood as I managed to break loose and dash for the door. I was actually on the steps when the hands grabbed my rucksack and tried to pull me back. I slipped my arms from the straps, and as I did so, the steps seemed to crumble under me and I was hurled out into the road. Half stunned by the fall and dazed by the pain in my ankle, I lay there for some moments, raising my head just in time to see that terrible motor coach, with its ghastly load, hang for a second over the cliff, and then plunge down into the sea. Never shall I forget the hopeless cry that floated up to me as the thing struck the rocks below. I must have fainted again, for I remember nothing more until I felt someone shaking me. It was morning, and a coastguard was bending over me. With his help, I managed to limp the 3 miles to his cottage, and from there he telephoned for a car to take me into St. Ives. From the coastguard, I ascertained the following facts. Over 12 years before, a party of men from the village of St. Erlid, just beyond St. Ives, chartered a motor coach to take them on an excursion to Newquay. The picnic became a drunken rout, and on the return journey, none of the company, not even the driver, was sober. That was before the new main road was made, and the coach returned by the cliff road, about 7 miles from St. Ives. Whilst the company were all singing tipsy songs, the vehicle plunged over the cliff, and not one of the party escaped death. One other queer thing I must record. My rucksack was returned to me a few days later. It had been found on the rocks, in the exact place where the coach had gone over 12 years ago. Lear grinned, pleased with himself for a tale well told. It was the very story he had in fact been reading just before his guests arrived, and he hoped he had remembered all the details correctly. He thought it a good one, and really quite scary. But if his young listeners shared that opinion, it was not readily apparent, for they responded with their now customary silence. Eventually, the elder of the two said,
"That didn't happen either."
"You're right," said Lear. "I got it out of a book. But you know," he added, aware of his dishonesty, "there aren't really any such things as ghosts or monsters." He now found himself rather ridiculously bristling with irritation. He could have understood if the children were fidgety with disinterest, but they just sat there regarding him coldly. They were like no children on earth he'd ever. "Why, you haven't drunk your hot chocolate," he said, noticing their full cups. "It'll be lukewarm now at best. Drink it up,"
"We're not thirsty,"
said the older child.
We are never thirsty,
said the younger.
only hungry.
This is intolerable, thought Lear. He had lost all patience with their inscrutable answers and their sullen impudence. There was still time, he reasoned, to throw them out into the night and send them off to wherever it was they came from. No transgression had taken place yet, after all. They hadn't even touched their drinks. But the dark part of Lear was winning, as it usually did, or used to, before he left the city behind and fled to this isolated backwater. That was why he had come here. He had indulged his peculiar appetites in cities where street urchins, latchkey kids, and poor neglected children had been as windfall fruit. His feasting grounds had been alleyways, derelict warehouses, squats, and tower blocks. He had haunted old railway lines, parks, and playgrounds at dusk. He had gorged himself. Oh, it was not his fault, he had reasoned. One cannot truly help one's appetites. The children he preyed upon were miserable, unloved wretches, neither missed when living or mourned when dead. Through him, their depressing existences gained meaning, or so he told himself. But it could not last. One or two, a handful, of missing children was par for the course, a regrettable fact of life. But as the number grew, he had begun to feel unsure, unsafe, as if there was always someone around the corner, a hand about to fall on his shoulder. At any moment, a knock upon the door. And so he had done what seemed the only sensible thing to do, and removed himself from temptation by coming to this glum cottage in the middle of nowhere. But now this pair of orphan children, he had not had to hunt for them as in the old days. They had arrived, entered no less, unbidden. They had walked of their own volition into the lion's den. They were as lambs to the slaughter, not even in the figurative sense. His dark heart said it would be rude not to, and Lear agreed. He was about to urge them to drink the poisoned hot chocolate, when he noticed something queer about those masks of theirs. the masks that now sat on the table between them, a feature he had not spotted before. "Who the hell are you?" he said sharply. The front door was locked and bolted. His pretended avuncular geniality was no longer necessary.
We told you already,
said the older child.
We're the Orphans,
said the younger. He snatched one of the masks and held it up. The papier-mâché was not completely painted over, so that here and there, newsprint was visible and readable. He now observed plainly the torn headlines. Missing children, spate of disappearances, another child taken, police are hunting, human remains found, search widens, mother's desperate plea.
Do you remember us now?
We're the children you took,
You scared us then.
but you don't scare us now.
The children stood up suddenly, and though it was absurd to be frightened of such small children, Lear trembled where he sat.
Shall we show him our faces?
Asked the younger child,
Yes, I think he is ready now.
said the older. Lear watched, frozen in terror, as the children began unwrapping these second masks from their faces. For what had seemed to be flesh was just another type of covering, one now unwound like bandages, unwound to reveal what? Lear did not intend to find out. He raced for the front door, overturning his chair as he went. He reached it and immediately cursed the bolts and chain and lock that now kept him the prisoner. He looked over his shoulder to see the two children moving slowly toward him in perfect unison. Their true faces were almost hard to decipher, so dim was the light in the hall, and so unlike anything earthly were they. They were dark black and looked like a crumpled material that had been flecked with white to suggest the stars in the galaxy, but the white was row upon row of razor-sharp teeth, and the neon moons were eyes that glittered and projected torch-like beams from a black canvas. They inched steadily towards him with sinister but unclear purpose. "Get away from me!" he cried. He was breathing heavily. His nostrils were filled with the awful stench that now permeated the cottage, the smell of sweet hot chocolate mixed with the acrid tang of earth and fettle. All fingers and thumbs, he managed finally to open the door, and at last propelled himself panting into the darkness without. But he was stopped in his tracks. In front of him, in a semicircle, stood more children like the horrible children inside, and beyond that first wall of children, a long line of others, stretching back up the dirt track and into the darkness, the furthest away only dimly perceptible from the faint twinkling behind the eyelets of their oval masks. It was almost as if the dank woods were lit by thousands of tiny candles. Oh, naturally, Lear screamed, but there was no one to hear him half a mile away in the village. The children performed the ritual with eerie solemnity. The slicing open, the scooping out of the goo, the careful tongue-out concentration as they cut with jagged shapes the face, the lighting and placing of the candle. Unaccustomed to visitors, it was the first time Godfrey Lear's cottage had ever seen a jack-o'-lantern in its porch on Halloween. The first and last. You have been listening to the EnCrypted Halloween special, read by Jasper L'Estrange, with special guest appearances by Lilith and Grizelda. From all here at EnCrypted Towers, we wish you a very happy Halloween. If you enjoy the show, why not become a patron on Patreon and gain access to exclusive content? It's the surest way to help me keep creating. You can also buy me a coffee, like, subscribe, comment, share, follow on social media, and read the description for more information about the show and how you can engage with it. Until next time, sweet dreams.